"You're just a sad old woman with nothing," my daughter-in-law said at the dinner table. She had spent 8 months building a trap around my name. What she never considered was that the 12-year-old boy sitting beside me had already written down every move she made, and I had spent 30 years making sure my name meant something. The dining room at my son's house seated 8 people comfortably. That Friday evening, there were 6 of us, and the room still felt too small. I arrived at 6:15, the way I always did a few minutes after the hour, so I wouldn't have to stand in the entryway making small talk while Calvin finished setting the table. 22 minutes from my house on Magnolia Street to their place on Beaufort Street. Past the old post office, left at the hardware store, right at the church with the broken gate nobody had fixed in 3 years. I knew every stoplight, every crepe myrtle tree lining the sidewalk. I knew this neighborhood the way you know, a place you've watched change slowly over time. Diane had outdone herself with the table. Cream-colored candles in silver holders, white roses in a crystal vase, cloth napkins folded into neat triangles beside each plate. I noticed she had placed me at the far end, closest to the kitchen door, farthest from Calvin. I didn't say anything about it. I had learned a long time ago that the quietest observations are often the most useful ones. Her parents were already seated, Beverly and Harold Sutton. Beverly had the kind of smile that reached her eyes only when she was talking about her own children. Harold stood when I walked in, which I appreciated more than I let on. Calvin met me at the door wearing the navy button-down I had given him 2 Christmases ago, the one he saved for occasions Diane considered important. He kissed my cheek and took my coat, and for just a moment he was the boy who used to fall asleep in the truck on the way home from Little League, his cleats still on, his face still dirty from the field. Then Diane appeared from the kitchen, and that moment was gone. She greeted me with the smile she kept specifically for my visits. Wide enough to be polite, brief enough to make clear it cost her something. Everything about Diane was intentional. I had understood that from the very beginning. Marcus was already at the table, 12 years old, sitting in the chair closest to the kitchen, slightly apart from the rest. He was wearing a collared shirt that sat too wide across his shoulders, the kind a boy wears when someone has told him to look respectable for company. He had Thomas's eyes, dark and careful, the kind that took everything in and gave very little back until they were ready. When he saw me come through the doorway, he didn't wave or call out. He just straightened slightly in his chair, the way he always did. I found my seat at the far end of the table and gave him a small nod across the centerpiece. That was enough for both of us. The first part of the evening passed the way those dinners always did. Harold talked about a fishing trip near Beaufort. Beverly asked Calvin about work. Diane refilled wine glasses with the efficiency of someone managing a production schedule rather than hosting a family dinner. I answered when spoken to, complimented the roasted chicken, which was genuinely good. I was watching the candle nearest to me burn down when Diane set her fork against the edge of her plate and looked across the table at me. What she said wasn't loud. That was the part that stayed with me long after I had driven home. She didn't raise her voice. She said it the way you might read a line from a document you had already reviewed, flat, considered, final, as though the words had been waiting in her mouth all evening, and she had simply decided this was the moment to release them. I set down my fork. Calvin looked at his plate. Beverly reached for her wine glass and didn't put it down. Harold found something very interesting to examine on the tablecloth in front of him. The candle kept burning. Outside, a car passed slowly down Beaufort Street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the dining room window and then disappearing. I did not respond. I folded my napkin, reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back in exactly the same spot. Then I pushed my chair back, excused myself quietly, and went to get my coat. I was standing near the front door, one arm already through my sleeve, when I heard small, careful footsteps in the hallway behind me. Not Calvin's heavy stride. Not Diane's deliberate click of heels. These were the practiced footsteps of someone who had learned how to move through a house without being noticed. Marcus came around the corner and crossed the entryway in 3 steps. He reached up and pressed something into the side pocket of my coat, something small, soft-covered, about the thickness of a paperback. Then he leaned close enough that I could smell the cedar from the good linen dresser. He whispered 4 words near my ear. "Don't let them take it, Grandma." Then he stepped back, straightened his collar, and walked quietly back down the hallway the same way he had come. I stood at the door with my hand resting against the outside of my coat pocket, feeling the small rectangular shape pressing through the fabric. I didn't take it out. I simply listened to the sound of voices resuming in the dining room, Diane's first, then Beverly's, then Harold's, and the particular silence where Calvin's voice should have been. Then I opened the front door and stepped out into the Charleston night. The air was cooler than I expected. The kind of cool that arrives in October without announcement, reminding you that the warmth you've been counting on is already leaving. I walked to my car, sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, and looked back at the lit windows of my son's house. He was 12 years old and already the bravest person in that house. I drove home the long way that night, not because I was lost. I have never been lost on those streets. I drove the long way because I needed the extra minutes, the extra stoplights, the extra turns to let the evening settle somewhere inside me before I walked back into my quiet house alone. But to understand what happened that night and everything that came after it, you need to understand who was sitting at that table. Not just a woman at a dinner, not just a mother-in-law in the wrong chair. You need to understand where I came from and what I had spent 30 years building quietly while the rest of the world looked the other direction. I met Thomas Whitfield when I was 24 years old. I was working the counter at a dry goods store on King Street, and he came in one Tuesday afternoon looking for a spool of heavy-duty thread. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had been doing real work since he was old enough to hold a tool. He didn't talk much, but when he did, every word was deliberate. The kind of man who didn't say anything he didn't mean. He came back the following Tuesday, and the one after that. By the third visit, he wasn't buying thread. We got married on a Saturday in March in the small Baptist church on Rutledge Avenue where Thomas had been baptized as a boy. My mother cried through the entire ceremony. Thomas's father shook my hand afterward and said, "You'll do." I decided to take that as a compliment. Those early years were not easy, and I won't pretend otherwise. Thomas had a vision, a logistics company that could serve the growing number of manufacturers and suppliers moving into the Charleston area. He had the instincts for it. What he didn't have, at least not in the beginning, was the money or the infrastructure to make it real. That part fell to me. I had learned to sew from my mother when I was 7 years old, sitting beside her at an old Singer machine in the back bedroom of our house on Morrison Street. By the time I married Thomas, I had turned that skill into a small alterations business operating out of our kitchen table. It wasn't glamorous work, hemming trousers, replacing zippers, taking in the waists of dresses for women who had lost weight and couldn't afford new clothes. But it was steady, and it was mine, and every dollar I made went into a jar on the top shelf of the kitchen cabinet that Thomas and I had agreed was for the future. That jar bought the first truck. 1 truck became 3. 3 became 7. By the time Calvin was old enough to ride along on Saturday deliveries, asking questions about every road sign and loading dock we passed, Whitfield & Sons had 12 trucks running routes across 3 counties. Thomas kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket at all times, not a fancy thing, just a plain composition notebook where he wrote down every route, every client, every rate adjustment, every detail that mattered. He said the most important things were always worth writing down. I thought about that notebook the night Marcus pressed his own small book into my coat pocket. Thomas was not a man who talked about success. He measured it differently. A contract renewed, a client who referred a neighbor, a driver who had been with us for 10 years and still showed up early. Those were the things that mattered to him. Not the size of the number on the balance sheet, but the steadiness of it. For 30 years, we built something together. Not loudly. Not in the way people build things when they want to be watched. Quietly, the way you fill a jar on a kitchen shelf $1 at a time, 1 decision at a time, 1 year at a time. Then, 7 years ago, Thomas was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer on a Wednesday morning in early October. By the following spring, he was gone. The last real conversation we had was in the garden behind our house on Magnolia Street. He was sitting in the chair he always used near the window, the one that caught the afternoon light. He had lost weight by then. His hands, which had always looked so capable, seemed thinner than I remembered. But his eyes were the same, dark and deliberate and entirely himself. He told me he had left something in the safe in the bedroom closet, a white envelope with my name on it. He said not to open it until I needed to. I asked him how I would know when that was. He almost smiled, the closest he could manage by then. "You'll know exactly what to do," he said. "You always did." He passed 11 days later on a Tuesday morning, while the camellia bush outside the bedroom window was just beginning to bloom. I buried him in the churchyard on Rutledge Avenue, 3 rows from where his father was buried, and I came home to a house that still smelled like cedar and coffee and 30 years of a life we had made together. I put the envelope in the safe, and I did not open it. Not when the first year was the hardest. Not when Calvin got married and the house felt smaller somehow. Not when the business required decisions I had never had to make alone before. I kept it sealed because opening it felt too close to an ending, and I was not ready for that. I kept that envelope for 7 years. The night Diane told me I didn't belong at her table, I finally understood when the time had come. I got home a little past 9 that Friday night. I hung my coat on the hook by the door, the one Thomas had installed the first week we moved into the house on Magnolia Street, drilled slightly crooked because he was in a hurry and never got around to fixing it, and I stood in the entryway for a moment without turning on the lights. The house was quiet, the way old houses get quiet at night, settling into itself, familiar and still. I could feel the weight of the small notebook in my coat pocket. I wasn't ready to open it yet. Instead, I walked to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood at the counter looking out the window at the backyard, where the camellia bush Thomas had planted the year we moved in was nothing more than a dark shape against the fence in the October night. 5 years ago, I thought. 5 years ago was when it started. Calvin had called me on a Sunday afternoon in early November, the kind of call where you can tell from the first 2 words that whatever comes next is going to require you to sit down. He had a son, he told me, a boy named Marcus, 7 years old. His mother, a woman named Patrice, whom Calvin had known years before he met Diane, had passed away 8 months earlier from an illness that had moved faster than anyone expected. There was no other family. Calvin was the only person left. I remember the silence on the phone after he finished explaining. Then I said, "When can I meet him?" Calvin brought Marcus over on a Saturday morning about 2 weeks later. The boy came through my front door wearing a collared shirt that was too big for him. I would notice, over the years, that someone always seemed to be putting Marcus in shirts that didn't quite fit, and he stood in the entryway with his hands at his sides, looking around the house the way a person looks at a place they're trying to memorize quickly in case they don't get to come back. He shook my hand when Calvin introduced us, a real handshake, firm and deliberate, the kind a child does when an adult has taught them that it matters. I thought of Thomas immediately. "It's good to meet you, Marcus," I said. He looked up at me with those dark, careful eyes. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Calvin told me you make things." "I used to alter clothes," I said. "Now I mostly fix things that need fixing." He considered that for a moment, with the seriousness of someone filing information away for later. "That sounds useful," he said. I decided I liked him enormously, right then and there. Diane did not share that feeling. She never said so directly. Diane rarely said anything directly that she could accomplish. Indirectly, but it was there in the particular way she referred to Marcus. Never by his name when she could avoid it. Always the boy, spoken with a slight pause before it, the way you might refer to an item on a list you hadn't planned to deal with today. She kept a careful physical distance from him in rooms. She did not ask about his schoolwork or his interests. When he spoke at the dinner table, she had a way of resuming her own conversation before he had quite finished his sentence. Marcus noticed. Children always notice. He just had the particular kind of dignity that kept him from showing it. He started coming to my house on Saturday mornings that first winter. Calvin would drop him off around 9, and we would spend the morning however Marcus felt like spending it. Sometimes he helped me in the garden. Sometimes he sat at the kitchen table doing homework, while I worked on alterations for neighbors who still brought me things to mend. He had Thomas's habit of keeping a small notebook with him, not the same kind, just whatever he had on hand where he wrote down things he wanted to remember, dates, names, overheard conversations, things that struck him as important. I never asked what he wrote. I figured he would tell me if he wanted to. What I noticed most about Marcus was that he was a watcher. He could sit quietly in a corner of a room for an hour and absorb more about what was happening than most adults could with their full attention. He remembered everything, not just facts, but the texture of things. The way someone's voice changed when they were nervous. The pause before an answer that meant the answer wasn't entirely true. He reminded me so much of Thomas that it sometimes stopped me mid-sentence. About 3 years after Marcus came to live with Calvin and Diane, I was at their house on a Sunday evening in the fall. dropping off a casserole because Calvin had mentioned Diane was working late all week. I let myself in through the side door, the way Calvin had told me to do years ago, and I was setting the dish on the kitchen counter when I heard Diane's voice coming from the study down the hall. She was on the phone. Her tone was the businesslike one she used when she... I was not trying to listen, but the house was quiet, and voices carry on quiet evenings. Once she signs, Diane said, "We move Marcus out within the week." A pause. Then Calvin's voice, lower, asking something I couldn't make out. "I'm serious," Diane said, "one situation at a time." I stood at the kitchen counter with my hand still resting on the casserole dish. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. Then I heard a small sound from the direction of the staircase. I turned my head slowly. Marcus was sitting on the third step from the bottom, his notebook open across his knees, a pen held loosely in his right hand. He was completely still. His eyes met mine across the length of the hallway, and in them I saw something that no 12-year-old should have to carry: the particular exhaustion of someone who has been waiting a long time for the truth to finally confirm what they already suspected. I gave him a small nod. He gave me one back. I picked up my purse, left the casserole where it was, and walked back out through the side door into the cool evening air. Marcus heard every word. So did I. By the time I pulled into the driveway on Magnolia Street, it was past 9:30. The porch light was on. I had left it on the way I always did when I went out at night, an old habit from the years when Calvin was a teenager and I needed to see his headlights coming up the street. The rest of the house was dark. I sat in the car for a moment with the engine off, listening to the neighborhood settle into its Friday night quiet. Someone 2 doors down was watching television, the faint sound of a laugh track drifting through a window. A dog barked once down the block and then stopped. I had been thinking about the notebook the entire drive home, not opening it, just thinking about it, the weight of it in my coat pocket, the fact that Marcus had pressed it into my hand without hesitating, without looking back, with the quiet certainty of someone who had been waiting for the right moment and recognized it when it finally came. I got out of the car, went inside, and hung my coat on the crooked hook by the door. Then I took the notebook out of the pocket and carried it to the kitchen table. It was a standard composition notebook, the kind you could buy at any drugstore for $1.50 black and white marbled cover, slightly worn at the corners, the pages filled with Marcus's careful, even handwriting. He had always printed his letters rather than writing in cursive, each one deliberate and unhurried, the way a person writes when they understand that what they're putting down on paper might matter later. I sat down at the table, turned on the lamp, and opened it to the first marked page. He had used small folded corners to flag the entries he wanted me to find, 3 of them. The first entry was dated 6 weeks earlier, a Thursday evening. Marcus had written it in the straightforward way. He wrote everything, without drama, just the facts as he had observed them. He had been doing homework at the kitchen table when Diane came in from the garage talking on her phone. She didn't notice him. She rarely did. She had been asking whoever was on the other end about something called an elderly competency, filing what the process involved, how long it typically took, what kinds of documentation would be required. She had written something down on the notepad she kept by the refrigerator and torn the page off before she left the room. Marcus had written the phrase down exactly as he heard it. Elderly competency filing. He had put a small question mark beside it, the way he marked things he didn't yet understand but intended to. I sat with that for a moment. Then I turned to the second flagged entry. This one was dated about a month earlier, a Sunday afternoon. Diane had been on the phone again, this time in the study with the door mostly closed. Marcus had been in the hallway returning a book to the shelf outside the study door. When he heard her mention the name Whitfield and Sons, he had stopped moving entirely his words, not mine, and listened. She had been asking questions about how a limited liability company was structured. Specifically, she had been asking about what happened to signing authority within an LLC if the primary owner was declared legally unfit to manage their own affairs. She had asked the question twice, in slightly different ways, as though she wanted to make certain she understood the answer correctly. Marcus had written it all down, every word he could catch. The question about the LLC, the question about signing authority, the question about legal incapacity. He had written at the bottom of the entry, in slightly smaller letters, "I don't know what all of this means yet, but I don't think it's good." He was right. It wasn't good. I turned to the third flagged entry, the most recent one, dated 11 days ago. This was the entry I already knew, part of the evening I had come by with the casserole, the conversation I had overheard through the quiet house, the moment on the staircase when Marcus and I had exchanged that wordless understanding across the hallway. But Marcus had written more than I had heard. Before I arrived that evening, he had been sitting at the top of the stairs doing exactly what he always did, listening and recording. Diane had been on the phone for nearly 20 minutes. The conversation Marcus documented was detailed and specific in ways that made my chest go tight as I read. She had been discussing a timeline, steps that needed to happen in a particular order, references to documents that needed to be in place before anything else could move forward. And then the line I had heard myself, standing at the kitchen counter with my hand on a casserole dish. Once she signs, we move Marcus out within the week. Seeing it written in Marcus's careful printing was different from hearing it spoken through a quiet hallway. Hearing it, I could still tell myself I might have misunderstood. Reading it in his handwriting, in context, surrounded by weeks of other careful observations, there was nothing left to misunderstand. I closed the notebook and set it flat on the table in front of me. The kitchen was very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the October wind moved through the camellia bush along the back fence, and the branches tapped lightly against the wooden slats in a rhythm that sounded almost like someone knocking. I thought about a 12-year-old boy sitting at the top of a staircase, night after night, writing down the things he heard because he had no other way to protect himself. Writing them down the way Thomas had always said important things deserved to be written down. Keeping a record because he understood, in whatever way a child understands such things, that the record might matter someday. I put my hand flat on the cover of the notebook. My grandson had been living inside a house full of secrets, and he had written every single one of them down. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after I closed the notebook. Long enough for the refrigerator to cycle through two of its quiet hums. Long enough for the wind outside to die down and pick back up again. Long enough for the lamp on the table to feel like the only light left in the world. Then I got up, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hallway to the bedroom. The closet was on the right side of the room, the way it had always been. Thomas's work boots were still on the bottom shelf. I had never moved them, and I did not intend to. Above the boots was the shelf where I kept extra blankets and the small fireproof box I had bought at a hardware sale 12 years ago for documents that mattered. Birth certificates, the deed to the house, Thomas's discharge papers from his time in the service, and one white envelope that I had placed there 7 years ago and had not touched since. I pulled the step stool from the corner, climbed up, and lifted the box down from the shelf. The combination was Thomas's birthday. It always had been. I turned the dial 3 numbers, slow and deliberate the way he had shown me, and the latch released with a soft click that seemed louder than it had any right to be in the quiet bedroom. The envelope was exactly where I had left it. White, letter-sized, slightly thicker than I remembered. My name was written on the front in Thomas's handwriting, not printed, but written in the careful cursive he only used for things he considered important. Just Ruth. No last name, as if there were no question in the world about who it was meant for. I carried it to the edge of the bed and sat down. For a moment I simply held it, feeling the weight of it. 4 pages, I would later count, folded in thirds the way Thomas folded everything precisely, the creases sharp and even. 7 years I had kept this sealed. 7 years of telling myself I would know when the time was right. I broke the seal and unfolded the pages. His handwriting covered both sides of each sheet in the steady, unhurried lines of a man who had thought carefully about every word before he committed it to paper. He had written the date at the top, a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks before he died. The camellia bush outside the window would have still had a few late blooms that week. I remembered that autumn as being unusually warm. He did not begin with sentiment. That was Thomas. He began with the thing that needed to be said. He wrote that he had spent the last several months working with George Whitfield, our family's attorney for more than 25 years, to make certain that everything we had built together was properly protected. Not just the house on Magnolia Street, not just the trucks and the contracts and the day-to-day operations, but the entire structure of what Whitfield and Sons had become over 3 decades. He had set things up carefully, he wrote, in a way that would hold even under pressure, especially under pressure. He did not use specific numbers. That was intentional. I understood as I read he was leaving the details for George to explain in person, at the right time, with the right documents in front of us. What Thomas gave me in the letter was not a financial statement. It was a map, the kind of map that tells you the road exists and that someone who loved you made sure it would still be there when you needed it. "Call George first thing," he wrote. "He has been expecting this call for some time. He knows everything. Trust him the way you have always trusted him, because he has earned it." The third page was practical, in the way Thomas was always practical. A list of what George would be able to show me, the kinds of decisions I would be able to make, the kinds of decisions that would require my direct involvement and could not be made by anyone else. He had underlined that phrase, pressing the pen down harder than the rest of the letter, as though he wanted to make certain I did not skim past it. "No one else, Ruth. Only you." I read that page twice. Then I turned to the fourth page. The handwriting here was slightly different, a little less steady, the letters just a fraction smaller, as though he had written this part on a different day when he had a little less energy but still needed to get it down. This page was shorter than the others. Half a page, maybe a little more. He wrote about Marcus. He had never met the boy. Marcus had come into Calvin's life after Thomas was already gone. But Thomas had known the way he always seemed to know things that hadn't happened yet, that Calvin's past would eventually find its way into our present. He had spoken to George about it. He had made provisions. He had been specific about what he wanted, and he had written it down in the same careful cursive he used for everything that truly mattered. "Tell him I knew," Thomas wrote. "Tell him that I heard about him from Calvin, near the end, and that I asked George to make sure there was a place for him. Tell him he was always mine, even before I knew his name." I had to set the letter down for a moment. Outside, the October wind had gone still. The house on Magnolia Street was completely quiet. No television from the neighbors, no dog down the block, nothing but the particular silence of a house where one person lives alone and has made a kind of peace with that. I picked the letter back up and read the last two lines. "You are going to know exactly what to do, Ruth. You always have. I built everything with you in mind, and I left it with you for a reason. When the time comes, you will know. You always did." I folded the 4 pages back along their original creases and held them in my lap. The bedroom was dark except for the small lamp on the nightstand. The fireproof box sat open on the bed beside me. Thomas's work boots were still on the shelf in the closet where they had always been. Thomas had been gone for 7 years, but sitting in the dark with that letter in my hands, it felt like he had never left. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the dark with Thomas's letter folded on the nightstand beside me and listened to the house settle around me the way old houses do in the small hours, the soft creak of the floorboards, the occasional tick of the radiator, the distant sound of a train moving through the edge of the city. At some point I must have dozed, because I remember the room being gray instead of black when I opened my eyes again and the clock reading 10 minutes past 6. I got up, made coffee, and sat at the kitchen table with Thomas's letter open in front of me until the light outside shifted from gray to pale gold. Then I picked up the phone and called George Whitfield. He answered on the second ring. "Ruth," he said before I had finished saying my own name. His voice carried the particular steadiness of a man who had been expecting a call for a very long time and had simply been waiting to find out which morning it would come. "I was wondering when you'd reach out." "Thomas told me to call you," I said. "I know," George said. "He told me the same thing 7 years ago. Are you free this morning?" George Whitfield had been our family's attorney since before Calvin was born. He was in his late 60s now, a quiet, deliberate man with silver hair, and the kind of unhurried manner that made you feel, in his presence, that whatever needed to be handled could in fact be handled. His office was on the 4th floor of a building on Broad Street, the kind of old Charleston building with high ceilings and tall windows that looked out over the rooftops toward the harbor. I had been there maybe a dozen times over the years for the deed on the house, for Thomas's will, for the occasional legal question that came up in the course of running a business. I arrived at 9:30. His assistant showed me into the office without making me wait. George stood when I came in, the way he always did, and shook my hand across the desk. He looked the same as he always had, a little more silver at the temples, maybe a few more lines around his eyes, but the same steady presence, the same careful attention. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk, and we both sat down. He already had a folder open in front of him. "Thomas asked me to keep this ready," he said, setting one hand on top of it. "He was very specific about what he wanted you to understand, and when." He paused. "I think you already know some of it." "Some," I said. George nodded and opened the folder. He walked me through it the way Thomas would have wanted, methodically, one piece at a time, without rushing. Whitfield & Sons Logistics had been restructured 11 years ago into a limited liability company, with me listed as the sole managing member. Not Thomas. Not the two of us jointly. Me, specifically, under my full legal name, Ruth Ann Whitfield. Thomas had insisted on that structure, George explained, because he had always believed the company's long-term stability depended on clear, unambiguous ownership. No gray areas. No room for interpretation. Every major decision, every contract renewal, every significant asset transfer, every change to the company's operating structure required my direct written authorization. Thomas had built that requirement into the founding documents deliberately and thoroughly. George had advised him it might be more flexible to allow for shared authority, and Thomas had declined. He said he trusted one person completely, George told me, and he wanted the paperwork to reflect that. I looked at the documents in the folder. My name appeared on every significant page. Then George told me the current assessed value of the company's assets. $5.2 million. I had known, in a general way, that Whitfield & Sons had grown. I had watched it grow, had made decisions that contributed to that growth, had signed documents and reviewed reports over the years that gave me a sense of the scale. But hearing the number stated plainly, in George's measured voice, in his quiet office on Broad Street on a Saturday morning, it settled over me differently than I expected. Not with surprise exactly, more with the particular weight of something you have always known but never said out loud. I sat with it for a moment. Then George said, "There's something else." He reached into the folder and removed a separate document, thinner than the others, and placed it on the desk between us. It was a limited power of attorney, 2 pages, dated 8 months ago. "This was filed with my office approximately 8 months back," he said. "It arrived by mail, with a cover letter indicating it had been signed and notarized." He paused. "It would have granted a third party significant authority over decisions related to the company's assets and operations." I looked at the signature line at the bottom of the second page. My name was there, written in what appeared to be my handwriting, the same slight forward lean, the same way the R connected to the U, the same small loop at the end of the final letter. "I didn't file it," George said quietly. "I held it because something felt wrong. The notarization was technically in order, but the signature," he stopped. "I've seen your signature on a great many documents over 25 years, Ruth. This one troubled me." I picked up the document and looked at it more carefully. It was close. Whoever had done it had been careful and had clearly worked from a real sample. But there was something slightly off in the pressure of the pen on certain letters, a hesitation in the middle of the last name that my hand had never made. Small things. The kind of things you would only notice if you had been looking at the same signature for a quarter century. I set the document back down on George's desk. He looked at me steadily across the table. "Ruth," he said, "this is your signature, but I don't think you wrote it." The room was very quiet. Through the tall window behind George's desk, I could see a narrow strip of Charleston rooftops and, beyond them, the pale morning sky above the harbor. I thought about Marcus's notebook sitting on my kitchen table at home. I thought about the 3 flagged entries. I thought about the phrase elderly competency filing and the questions about signing authority within an LLC. I thought about the particular efficiency with which certain people plan certain things. "No," I said, "I didn't." George nodded once, slowly, and made a small note on the legal pad beside the folder. I drove home on Broad Street with both hands on the wheel and the Saturday morning traffic moving quietly around me. Someone had been using my name, and they had been doing it for 8 months. George called me Sunday evening, just after 7. He had located a document examiner. He trusted a woman named Patricia Odom, who worked out of an office on King Street and had spent the better part of 30 years analyzing handwriting and questioned documents for attorneys, insurance companies, and occasionally the courts. She could see us Monday morning at 9, if I was available. I told him I would be there. I spent most of Sunday in the garden, pulling up the last of the summer plants and turning the soil along the back fence, the way Thomas had taught me work that kept my hands busy and let my mind run where it needed to go. By the time I came inside and washed up, I had turned the question over from every angle I could think of, and I still kept arriving at the same place. 8 months ago. Someone had filed that document 8 months ago. I was at George's office by 20 minutes to 9 on Monday morning. Patricia Odom arrived exactly at 9, a small, precise woman in her early 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and a soft-sided briefcase she set on George's conference table without ceremony. She shook my hand, shook George's, and got directly to work. George had prepared 3 documents for comparison. The question signature, the one from the limited power of attorney filed 8 months ago. 2 authenticated samples of my signature pulled from documents I had signed in George's office over the past several years, both witnessed and dated. Patricia laid all 3 pages side by side on the light table she had brought with her and studied them without speaking for several minutes. I watched her work. She used a magnifying loupe, moving slowly along the signature lines, occasionally making a small mark on her notepad. She did not narrate what she was seeing. She simply looked, with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that the most important details were often the ones you almost missed. Finally, she straightened up. The question's signature was not written by the same hand as these 2 authenticated samples, she said. She said it the way you might report the weather plainly, without drama, as a simple statement of observable fact. The overall appearance is close. Whoever produced this worked carefully and had access to a good sample of the genuine signature. But there are consistent differences in the pressure distribution across the downstrokes, a wider letter spacing in the middle section, and the terminal stroke on the final letter has a different angle entirely. She set her loupe down on the table. In my professional opinion, this is a fabricated signature. George wrote something on his legal pad. Patricia began packing her equipment back into the briefcase. If this document was filed with any official body as genuine, she said, almost as an afterthought, that would constitute forgery under South Carolina law, which is a felony. She closed her briefcase, shook our hands again, and left. George and I sat across from each other at the conference table for a moment after she was gone. Someone filed that document as genuine, I said. Yes, George said. They did. I looked at the 3 pages still spread across the table. The authentic signatures. The one that wasn't mine. And then, sitting there in George's conference room on a Monday morning with Patricia Odom's words still settling in the air, I remembered. 8 months ago had been a Tuesday. I remembered it as a Tuesday because I had been expecting the grocery delivery that afternoon and I was watching the clock. Diane had come by the house unannounced, which was not unusual for her. She occasionally stopped in when she was in the neighborhood, though the visits were always brief and purposeful rather than social. She had been carrying a manila envelope and a pleasant, businesslike expression. Calvin had asked her to drop these off, she said. Some insurance paperwork that needed to be in my files. Nothing urgent, she said. Just routine documentation that the company's insurance carrier required periodically. She set the envelope on the kitchen table and asked if I wanted coffee. I said yes, and went to put the kettle on. I was in the kitchen for perhaps 30 minutes, long enough to make the coffee, find the good cups, bring out the shortbread tin I kept on the second shelf. Diane sat at the kitchen table with her phone, the way people do when they are waiting politely. The manila envelope sat on the table between us. I never opened it. She told me I could review the documents at my leisure and just keep them for my records. There was nothing requiring my signature, she said, just informational. I thanked her for dropping them off, and she left shortly after. I had put the envelope in the drawer beneath the telephone table in the hallway, the drawer where I kept things I intended to get to eventually, and I had not thought about it again. Sitting in George's office on Monday morning, I thought about the 30 minutes I had spent in the kitchen with my back turned. 30 minutes was more than enough time for a careful person to remove one document from a manila envelope, press it flat against a hard surface, and use the pen in her bag to trace the signature from something she had studied and practiced beforehand. Then slide it back, leave the envelope sitting right where it had been, and wait for the kettle. She hadn't needed me to sign a thing. She had just needed my kitchen table, 30 uninterrupted minutes, and a signature she had already spent time learning to replicate. She didn't need me to sign. She just needed my signature. I folded my hands on the conference table and looked at George. He was already writing on a fresh page of his legal pad, his pen moving with the same steady precision he brought to everything. He had a particular expression when he was preparing to take action, not angry, just focused, the way a door looks right before someone opens it. "George," I said. He looked up. "What happens next?" He finished the sentence he was writing before he answered. "I make some calls," he said, "to the right people." He picked up his phone from the corner of the desk, and I gathered my coat and my bag and walked out of his office into the Monday morning light on Broad Street. Diane hadn't made a mistake. She had made a crime, and George was already calling the right people. George called Tuesday morning at 8:45. I was in the backyard, deadheading the last of the rose bushes along the south fence, the ones Thomas had planted the second summer we lived on Magnolia Street, which had never quite grown the way he intended, but had kept blooming stubbornly every year regardless. I had my gardening gloves on and a pair of clippers in my hand when my phone rang in my jacket pocket. "Can you come back to the office this morning?" George said. "There's something I need to show you, something I should have put together sooner, but I wanted to be certain before I said anything." I pulled off my gloves and told him I could be there by 10. He was waiting for me in the conference room when I arrived, the same room where Patricia Odom had laid out her comparison pages 2 days earlier. The light table was gone. In its place, George had spread a different set of documents across the table, thicker this time, bound with binder clips, color-coded tabs marking certain pages. A yellow legal pad sat beside them, already half filled with his careful handwriting. He waited until I had sat down and set my coat over the back of the chair before he started. "I've been going through the company's active contracts," he said. "All of them. Assets, obligations, renewal schedules." He pulled one bound document toward me and opened it to a tabbed page near the middle. "This one concerns me most." The document was a supply and logistics agreement between Whitfield & Sons and a company called Hartwell Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing operation based out of Columbia, with distribution across 4 states. I recognized the name. Whitfield & Sons had been their primary logistics provider for going on 9 years. It was one of the company's oldest and most reliable client relationships. George pointed to a line near the bottom of the page. The contract was due for renewal in 87 days. Under the terms of the LLC operating agreement, George said, renewal of any contract valued above a certain threshold requires the direct written authorization of the managing member. He paused. "That's you, Ruth. Only you." I looked at the renewal clause. The language was straightforward and unambiguous. Thomas had insisted on that kind of language in every document George had ever drafted for the company. No proxies, no delegated authority for decisions of this magnitude. The managing member's signature, in person, witnessed and dated. "What's the annual contract value?" I asked. George turned to another tabbed page. $3.8 million. I sat with that number for a moment. 9 years was a long time for a business relationship, long enough for Hartwell to have built their entire logistics operation around Whitfield & Sons. Long enough that losing the contract wouldn't just be inconvenient, it would require them to restructure a significant part of how they moved their product across 4 states. That kind of disruption had consequences that rippled outward in all directions. "What happens if the contract isn't renewed?" I asked. "Hartwell would need to find alternative logistics coverage within a relatively short window," George said, "which would be difficult and expensive." He paused. "But that's not the part I want you to focus on." He reached for the legal pad and turned it so I could read what he had written. The name at the top of the page was Diane Whitfield. George had drawn a clean, methodical line connecting 3 points. The first was the limited power of attorney filed 8 months ago, the document with the forged signature, which, if accepted, would have granted a third-party authority over exactly the kind of major business decisions that required my direct authorization. The second was the elderly competency filing inquiry Marcus had recorded in his notebook, the specific question about what happened to signing authority when a primary owner was declared legally unfit. The third was Hartwell Industries and the contract renewal coming due in 87 days. George tapped the legal pad lightly with his pen. "Diane is currently serving as lead outside counsel for Hartwell Industries in a significant commercial litigation matter. The case has been ongoing for 14 months. The outcome depends substantially on Hartwell's continued financial stability and their existing business relationships." I looked at the 3 connected points on the legal pad. If Diane had obtained the power of attorney using the forged signature, she would have had the authority to act on behalf of Whitfield & Sons in contract matters. She could have renewed the Hartwell contract herself, on terms favorable to Hartwell, securing the client relationship her own legal case depended on. If, at the same time, I had been declared legally unfit to manage my own affairs, which the competency filing inquiry had been laying the groundwork, for there would have been no one in a position to question what she had done or undo it afterward. The whole structure of it came into focus at once, the way a photograph develops first vague shapes, then edges, then a complete image you cannot unsee. She hadn't come after the company because she wanted to own it. She had come after it because she needed one thing from it. One contract, one renewal, one signature that would keep her most important legal case alive and her career on solid ground. She didn't just want my money. She wanted the one thing my signature could give her her career. I set the legal pad back on the table. George was watching me carefully, the way he always did when he was letting someone work through something at their own pace. The forged power of attorney would have let her sign the renewal herself, I said. And if the competency filing had gone through, I wouldn't have been in a position to challenge it. That's correct. And she needed both pieces in place before the 87 days ran out. George nodded slowly. She was working against a deadline she couldn't control. I looked out the tall window behind George's desk at the Charleston rooftops and the pale November sky above the harbor. A single pelican was making its way slowly across the strip of visible water in the distance, unhurried, knowing exactly where it was going. I thought about Thomas's letter on my nightstand. No one else, Ruth, only you. He had written that years before any of this existed. He had written it because he understood, in the careful way he understood most things, that the value of something isn't always obvious to the people who want to take it, and that the best protection against that was clarity. Absolute, documented, unambiguous clarity about who held the authority and who did not. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. "Not yet," I said to George, when I saw him reach for his phone. "Don't sign or file anything yet. I want to understand the full picture first." George lowered his hand. He gave me the particular look he reserved for moments when he thought I was about to do something he didn't entirely expect. Not disagreement, just attention. "How long do you need?" he asked. "Not long," I said. I buttoned my coat and picked up my bag. Diane Whitfield had spent 8 months engineering the perfect trap. What she didn't know was that the trap had always belonged to me. I called Sandra from the parking garage on Broad Street before I had even started the car. She picked up on the third ring, the way she always did, never the first, which she said made a person seem desperate. Never past the fourth, which she said was just rude. "I need you to come over," I said. A brief pause. "How bad?" "Bring coffee," I said. "And whatever you have in the freezer that qualifies as dessert." "Give me 45 minutes," she said, and hung up. Sandra Cho had been my closest friend for 31 years. We had met at a neighborhood association meeting the year Thomas and I moved to Magnolia Street. She had been living 3 houses down with her husband Raymond, who passed 6 years ago, and we had been the only 2 women at that meeting who brought our own pens. That detail had apparently been enough to establish the foundation of a friendship that had since outlasted 2 kitchen renovations, 1 flooded basement, the deaths of both our husbands, and more difficult conversations than I could count. She arrived at 43 minutes, which for Sandra was essentially on time, carrying a paper bag from the coffee place on King Street and a container of glazed donuts she had picked up on the way. "Sit down," I said. "I am sitting down," she said, pulling out a chair at the kitchen table. "Talk." I told her everything. Not a summary, everything. Starting with Friday night's dinner. Moving through the notebook and the envelope in George's office and Patricia Odom and the legal pad with 3 connected points, I talked for a long time. Sandra listened the way she always listened, which was completely no interrupting, no filling silences with reassurances, no redirecting toward the bright side until she had heard the whole of it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she poured us each a second cup of coffee. 87 days, she said. 87 days, I confirmed. Sandra wrapped both hands around her cup. She had sharp eyes, Sandra the kind that noticed things people assumed went unnoticed, and they had that particular focused quality they got when she was running something through her mind from multiple angles. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "That's why I called you." She set her cup down carefully. "About 3 months ago, it would have been a Wednesday, because I had my hair appointment on King Street that morning and I always stop at the coffee shop on East Bay Street after I saw Diane. I waited. She was at a corner table in the back," Sandra continued. "The kind of table you pick when you don't want to be seen from the door. She was with a man I didn't recognize. Late 50s, I'd say. Heavy-set, dark blazer, the kind of shoes that cost more than they should." Sandra paused. He had a laptop open and a stack of folders on the table between them. They were going through papers together. Diane was pointing at something on the screen. "Did you hear anything?" Sandra shook her head. "I was too far away, and the place was busy, but I watched them for a few minutes while I was waiting for my order. It wasn't a casual meeting. Whatever they were discussing, they had been at it for a while before I got there, and they were still at it when I left." "Did Diane see you?" "No. She had her back to most of the room. I don't think she would have chosen that table otherwise." Sandra picked up her cup again. "I thought about mentioning it to you at the time, but I didn't know what I was looking at, and I didn't want to." She stopped. "Cause trouble," I said. "Start something that might have been nothing," Sandra said, which was her more precise way of saying the same thing. "But it wasn't nothing, was it?" "No," I said. "It wasn't." We sat with that for a moment. The man Sandra described didn't match anyone in Diane's professional circle that I knew of. He wasn't a partner at her firm. I had met most of them at the one company event Diane had brought Calvin to 2 years back. He wasn't anyone from the Hartwell matter that George had mentioned, which left the other category of person you meet in a back corner of a coffee shop with a laptop and a stack of folders when you are a lawyer who needs information that isn't easy to obtain through official channels. Someone you hire to find things out, or to help you build something that needs to stay quiet until it's finished. 3 months ago, which meant the planning had been going on for at least that long before Marcus started writing things down in his notebook, possibly longer. Sandra was watching me across the table. "Ruth," she said quietly, "I know. She didn't just decide to do this last month." "No," I said, "she didn't." Sandra leaned forward slightly, her elbows on the table, her voice dropping to the careful register she used when she was saying something she wanted to make sure landed correctly. "She's been planning this longer than you think." I looked at my coffee cup. At the kitchen table where I had sat with Thomas going over invoices and route schedules on more evenings than I could count. At the window above the sink where the light was going amber and low, the way it did on Tuesday afternoons in November, when the season was already turning. 87 days. George had the forgery documentation. Patricia Odom had her professional opinion in writing. Marcus had 3 flagged entries in a composition notebook that laid out the sequence of events with the careful accuracy of a boy who had learned from an early age that important things were worth writing down. And now Sandra had placed a man with a laptop and a stack of folders in a corner coffee shop on East Bay Street 3 months before any of this had come to the surface. I looked up at her. "So have I," I said. Sandra held my gaze for a moment. Then she reached across the table and pushed the donut container toward me. "Then eat something," she said. "You're going to need the energy." I drove her home at 6:30 with the November dark already fully settled over Magnolia Street and the porch light coming on automatically the way it always did. I had 87 days, and for the first time since Thomas died, I knew exactly what to do with them. 2 days after Sandra left, my phone rang. I hadn't reached out to Calvin. Diane had reached out for me. Those 2 days, Wednesday and the better part of Thursday, I had spent quietly and deliberately, not waiting, preparing. Wednesday morning, I drove to George's office for an hour to go over the timeline he was building, the sequence of documentation that would need to be in order before anything else could move. George worked the way Thomas had worked, methodically, without rushing, making certain each piece was solid before moving to the next. I left his office at noon with a clearer picture of where things stood and what still needed to happen. Wednesday afternoon, I went to the sewing room. It was a small room at the back of the house on Magnolia Street that I had converted from a storage space about 15 years ago, good natural light from the east-facing window, a long work table Thomas had built from reclaimed pine, shelves along one wall holding bolts of fabric and thread organized by color the way my mother had taught me. I hadn't taken in regular alteration work for several years, but I still went in there when I needed to think clearly. There was something about the specific concentration that hand sewing required, the small, exact movements, the needle finding its path through layers of fabric that quieted everything else and let the important thoughts arrange themselves in the right order. I had a pair of curtains that had needed rehemming for the better part of 2 years. I finally got to them on Wednesday afternoon. Thursday morning, I watered the plants on the back porch and made a grocery list, and did 2 loads of laundry and all the ordinary things that life requires regardless of what else is happening alongside it. I had learned that particular lesson early, that the world does not pause for your difficult situations, and that there is something stabilizing about tending to the small, necessary things even when larger ones are pressing. I was back in the sewing room just after 1 o'clock Thursday afternoon, finishing the second curtain panel, when my phone rang on the workbench beside me. Calvin. I set down my needle and picked up the phone. "Hi, Mom." His voice had a careful quality to it that I recognized immediately, not his natural register, which was easy and unhurried, but the slightly measured version he used when he had been thinking about what he wanted to say before he said it. He had used that voice as a teenager when he had something to confess. He was using it now. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. A brief pause. "How are you doing?" "Fine," I said. "I'm in the sewing room. How are you?" "Good, good." Another pause, shorter. "I talked to Diane this morning." I waited. "She mentioned she's been a little worried about you," Calvin said. She said she thought you might be struggling a little. Financially. I looked at the curtain panel on the work table in front of me. The hem was straight and even, exactly as it should be. "Did she?" I said. "She mentioned the company," Calvin continued, still in that careful voice. She said she'd heard some things, and she thought maybe the business wasn't doing as well as it used to, and she thought it might be worth having some family oversight. Just to make sure everything was in order. Family oversight, the phrase from Marcus's notebook, written down 6 weeks ago on a Thursday evening in Diane's own voice, landed in the middle of the conversation, like something solid dropped from a height. "Mom," Calvin said, "is everything okay with the company?" I considered how to answer that. The true answer was that everything with the company was considerably more than okay, that Whitfield & Sons was a $5.2 million operation with a 30-year client relationship coming up for renewal and an LLC structure that Thomas had spent the last months of his life making certain was protected against exactly the kind of interference that was currently being attempted. But that was not the conversation I was going to have with my son on a Thursday afternoon phone call that Diane had apparently orchestrated. "Everything is fine, Calvin," I said. "The company is fine." A silence followed. I counted it without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The refrigerator in the kitchen cycled on with its low hum. 4, 5. A car slowed at the stop sign on the corner outside and then moved on. 6, 7. Somewhere in the camellia bush along the back fence, a bird shifted its weight on a branch and the leaves rustled once. 8, 9. "Diane just wants to help," Calvin said. His voice had changed slightly on those words, not much, just enough. The careful quality was still there, but underneath it was something else, something that sounded less like conviction and more like a man repeating a sentence he had been given and was still deciding whether it fit. "I know, son," I said. Another silence, briefer this time. "Okay," he said. "I just wanted to check in." "I'm glad you did," I said. And I meant it, though not for the reasons he probably assumed. We said goodbye, and I set the phone back on the workbench. I sat for a moment looking at the second curtain panel. The hem ran straight and clean from one end to the other, each stitch placed with the same spacing as the one before it. That was the thing about careful work done right. You couldn't see the effort that had gone into it. You just saw the result. Calvin had called because Diane had asked him to. He had used her language struggling financially, family oversight, without knowing, I believed, where those words had come from or what they had been designed to accomplish. He had asked the question she had pointed him toward and accepted my answer with something that sounded almost like relief. He didn't know about the forged signature. He didn't know about the Hartwell contract or the 87 days or the competency filing inquiry or the man with the laptop in the corner of the coffee shop on East Bay Street. He knew the version of the story Diane had given him, and he had been living inside that version without knowing it had walls. My son wasn't my enemy. He was just a man who had been told a very convincing story. The question was whether he would believe it when he heard mine. I sent Calvin a text message Friday evening, just after dinner. Nothing elaborate, just, "Lunch tomorrow, just the two of us? There's a place on King Street I've been meaning to try." He replied 20 minutes later. "Sure, Mom. Noon work?" I brought the notebook. I had thought about that decision for most of Friday night, whether to bring it, when to show it, how much to say before I did. By the time I fell asleep, I had decided that the notebook would say more than I could, and that the right moment to put it on the table would announce itself when it came. The restaurant on King Street was a narrow, unpretentious place with wooden booths and paper menus and a lunch crowd that was mostly regulars. The kind of place where nobody looked up when you walked in and the coffee came without being asked. It felt like the right setting for a conversation that needed to happen on honest ground. Calvin was already there when I arrived, sitting in a booth toward the back with his jacket still on and a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. He stood when he saw me, the way I had raised him to do, and we hugged briefly in the aisle. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a busy week, something deeper, the kind that shows up around the eyes and in the set of the shoulders. He had Thomas's broad build and the easy smile that had made him well-liked his whole life. But sitting across from me that Saturday noon, he looked older than his years in a way I hadn't noticed before. We ordered the daily special without much discussion and talked about ordinary things for a few minutes. A project at his office, the weather turning, the pecan tree in my backyard. The conversation had the particular quality of two people who are both aware they are not yet talking about the thing they came to talk about. Then Calvin set his fork down. "Mom, about Thursday, about what Diane said." "What did she say?" I asked, though I already knew. He shifted in his seat. "She's concerned about the company. She mentioned a power of attorney arrangement, something that would let her assist with some of the business decisions. She said it was just to take some of the pressure off." "Did she tell you the company was struggling?" "She implied it," Calvin said. He had the decency to look uncomfortable. "She said you'd been dealing with a lot since Dad died, and that it might be more than you could handle alone." He paused. "I should have asked you directly, instead of just accepting what I was told." "Yes," I said, "you should have." I reached into my bag and put the notebook on the table between us. Calvin looked at it. "Marcus gave me this," I said. "The night of the dinner. He put it in my coat pocket when I was leaving." Something moved behind his eyes, not quite surprise, but the look of a person watching something they had been half expecting arrived sooner than anticipated. "Read it," I said. "The pages with the folded corners." He picked it up and read slowly, the way he had always read things that mattered, going back over sentences, pausing at the parts that needed time. When he finished the third entry, he set the notebook down and looked at the middle distance for a moment, his hands flat on the table on either side of it. "The competency filing," he said quietly. "I didn't know about that." "I know you didn't. She told me it was just a standard power of attorney. Something routine." He shook his head. "I thought she was worried about you." "She told you that to make sure you wouldn't ask questions," I said. Calvin looked up. His voice went quiet in the way voices do when the speaker is ashamed of the words they are saying. "She told me you were losing your memory, Mom. That you'd been confused about financial things, making decisions that didn't make sense." I looked at my son across the table. "I know, son," I said. "That's how she kept us apart." The restaurant continued its ordinary Saturday business around us. The waitress topped off a coffee 2 booths over. Someone near the door laughed at something. The city moved past the window the way it always did. Calvin picked up the notebook again. He held it for a moment, looking at the worn corners where Marcus's hands had turned it over and over in the weeks he had been carrying it. Then he closed it carefully, the way you close something you intend to treat with care. For a long time, he didn't say anything at all. My son folded the notebook closed. For the first time in years, he looked like the boy I used to know. Calvin called me Monday afternoon at 2:30. I knew something had shifted the moment I heard his voice. It wasn't the careful, measured tone he had used on Thursday's call, the one that sounded rehearsed, the words arriving in the order someone else had arranged them. This was different. This was the voice of a man who had just looked directly at something he had been avoiding and found it worse than he had prepared himself for. I had spent Sunday and Monday morning the way I had spent most of the past week, quietly, deliberately, one task at a time. Sunday, I had driven to George's office to review the documentation timeline he was building. Monday morning, I had gone over the Hartwell contract renewal terms again at my kitchen table, making notes in the margin of my own legal pad in the careful shorthand Thomas had taught me decades ago. I was in the middle of that when Calvin called. "Mom," he said, and then nothing else for a moment. "I'm here," I said. I heard him exhale. "I need to tell you what I did this morning." "Diane left for work at 8, he said. She had a full-day client meetings, a court appearance in the afternoon. She wouldn't be home before 6 at the earliest. Calvin had taken the day as a remote workday, which meant he was alone in the house on Beaufort Street for the better part of 10 hours. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee at 8:30, he said, looking at the notebook I had given him at lunch on Saturday. He had read the 3 flagged entries again in the morning light, slowly, the way you reread something when you are hoping the second reading will produce a different result. It didn't. He had gone into the study. Diane's laptop was on the desk, closed but not locked. She had never set a password on it in all the years they had been married, which Calvin said he had always taken as a sign of trust and was now reconsidering. He had opened it and sat down. He hadn't gone looking for anything specific, he told me. He had started with her email, not because he had a particular destination in mind, but because the notebook had given him a direction and he was following it to see where it led. He found the folder within 20 minutes. It was labeled with a client matter number rather than a name, the kind of neutral, uninformative label a careful person uses when they want something to be findable by them and opaque to anyone else. But the contents were not neutral. The folder contained an email thread between Diane and an attorney she had apparently retained separately from her firm, a private engagement, billed to a personal account rather than a professional one. The thread went back 11 months. The emails discussed, in the specific language of people who believed they were communicating privately, the process of establishing a power of attorney over the assets of an elderly individual who could be demonstrated to be experiencing cognitive decline. They discussed the LLC structure of Whitfield and Sons. They discussed the Hartwell Industries contract renewal and what a properly authorized signature could accomplish before the deadline arrived. They discussed timelines. They discussed documentation. In one email, dated 9 months ago, Diane had written, "The signature is the only obstacle. Once that's handled, the rest follows automatically." Calvin's voice, as he read me that line over the phone, had the particular flatness of someone who is keeping themselves very controlled because the alternative is something they are not ready for in the middle of a Monday afternoon. He had kept going. In the bottom drawer of Diane's desk, he had found a small external drive, the kind that costs almost nothing and holds everything. He had plugged it in. Most of the files were work documents, the kind of dense legal materials that filled every corner of Diane's professional life. But near the end of the directory, in a folder with no label at all, he had found a series of audio files. He had recognized the naming convention immediately. Marcus had a system for his recordings. Calvin had seen it before without understanding it, the way the files were dated and numbered in the boy's careful, methodical way. The files on Diane's drive were copies, which meant Diane had found Marcus's recordings at some point and copied them before he could use them, which also meant she knew what he had been doing. Calvin had listened to 20 minutes of audio sitting alone in the study on Beaufort Street. He did not tell me everything he heard. He didn't need to. His voice told me enough. When he finished, he sat in the study for a while without doing anything, he said. Just sitting. The way you sit when you have arrived somewhere you knew you were heading but still weren't quite ready to reach. Then he called me. "Mom," he said, when he had finished telling me all of it. His voice had steadied somewhat, but only somewhat, the way a person's voice steadies when they are concentrating very hard on keeping it that way. "I need you to tell me everything. All of it." I looked at my legal pad on the kitchen table. At Thomas's handwriting in the margins of the first pages, still sharp and clear after all these years. At my own notes alongside his, the two of us still working the same problem from different sides of the same table, the way we always had. "I know," I said. "I've been waiting for you to ask." For the first time in years, my son was finally ready to listen, and I finally had everything worth saying. George arrived at 8:15 Tuesday morning. I had been up since 6. The coffee was already made, the kitchen table cleared, and the November light was just beginning to come through the east window when I heard his car pull into the driveway on Magnolia Street. Calvin had stayed the night in the guest room the first time he had slept in this house in several years, and I could hear him moving in the hallway upstairs when George knocked at the front door. Marcus was in the small back room, his school backpack placed on the hallway shelf with the careful precision of a boy who had learned not to leave things where they might be in the way. I let George in, poured him a coffee without asking, and we sat down at the kitchen table together. By the time Calvin came downstairs, George's documents were arranged in the order he intended to go through them. He walked us through each piece methodically, Patricia Odom's written professional opinion, the forged power of attorney cross-referenced against the timeline Marcus had recorded, the email thread Calvin had found on Monday printed and organized with small yellow tabs, and the audio file summary his paralegal had prepared. He laid each piece on the table in sequence, the way you lay cards when you want someone to see, not just the individual cards, but the hand they form together. When he finished, he folded his hands on top of the stack. "This is sufficient for a criminal complaint," he said. "The forgery alone is a felony under South Carolina law. The email thread establishes intent and premeditation going back 11 months. The audio files corroborate the written record at every significant point. He paused. What happens next is entirely Ruth's decision. Calvin looked at me from across the table. Not yet, I said. George nodded as though he had expected this. I want to talk to her first, I said, in person. Before anything gets filed, I looked at the documents spread across Thomas's kitchen table. I have spent 30 years building this company quietly. I would like to handle the end of this quietly as well. I paused. After that, George files whatever needs to be filed. Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once. George made a note on his legal pad and moved on. I picked up my phone and stepped to the kitchen counter. The contact I needed was in my files under Hartwell Industries' Warren Oglesby, the senior operations manager I had worked with directly for the better part of a decade. He answered on the second ring, and I told him I was calling to confirm the renewal timeline on our logistics agreement. 79 days, he said. I told him the renewal would be handled directly by me, as managing member, well ahead of the deadline. He said he was glad to hear it, and we said goodbye. I set the phone down on the counter. George and Calvin were both watching me. The kitchen was very quiet. Then my phone rang. Diane's name on the screen. George's pen stopped moving. Calvin's hand, resting beside his coffee cup, went still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a mockingbird called once from the camellia bush along the back fence, and then went silent. I picked up on the second ring. Ruth. Her voice was the prepared one, smooth, businesslike, the tone she used when she had thought through what she wanted to say before she said it. I think it would be good for us to talk, clear the air a little. Things have felt tense lately, and I'd like the chance to address that directly. All right, I said. A brief pause. She had expected more resistance. I was thinking sometime this week. Thursday maybe, or... Come for dinner, I said. Tonight. Silence. Tonight, she repeated. 6 o'clock, I said. You know where I live. Another pause. Shorter than the first. The almost imperceptible recalibration of someone who had prepared for one version of a conversation and was being handed a fundamentally different one. Yes, she said. All right, tonight. I thanked her and ended the call. When I turned back to the table, George was watching me with the expression he wore when he was quietly revising his expectations upward. Calvin had both hands around his coffee cup and was looking at the middle distance. Then came the soft sound of footsteps on the stairs. Small and careful, the practiced movements of a boy who had spent years learning to cross a room without drawing attention. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed, his notebook in his hand, his dark eyes moving around the room with the steady attention he brought to everything. He looked at me. "Are you scared, Grandma?" he asked. I considered the question the way it deserved to be considered, not quickly, not with false reassurance, but honestly, the way Thomas had always believed serious questions deserved to be answered. "No," I said. "Your grandfather taught me that the quietest people in the room are usually the most prepared." Marcus looked down at the notebook in his hand. Then he looked back up at me with Thomas's eyes dark and careful and entirely certain of what they were seeing, and gave me the small nod that had always been enough between us. The rest of the day moved the way days move before something important happens. George stayed until noon. Calvin made lunch, and we ate together at the kitchen table, with the papers set aside. The four of us talking about ordinary things in the way people do when they are resting, before something that requires everything they have. In the afternoon, Marcus sat in the sewing room doing homework. Calvin stayed at the table, reading through the documents one final time. I prepared dinner. By 5:30, the table was set. By 5:45, we had each taken our places, George in the armchair with his folder, Calvin on the sofa with the printed emails folded in his jacket pocket, Marcus in Thomas's old reading chair with his notebook open across his knees, and me at the kitchen counter, dish towel in my hands, watching the front window. By the time Diane's headlights swept across the front window that evening, we were ready, every single one of us. The headlights swept once across the front window and went dark. I set the dish towel on the counter and walked to the entryway. Behind me, the sitting room was quiet, George in his armchair, Calvin on the sofa, Marcus in Thomas's old reading chair with his notebook closed now across his knees. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The house held itself the way houses do before something that has been a long time coming finally arrives. A car door closed in the driveway, Footsteps on the front walk the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has prepared herself for a difficult meeting and is arriving on her own terms. The doorbell rang at exactly 6 o'clock. I opened the door. Diane stood on the front porch in a dark blazer, her hair done the way she wore it for professional appearances, a small bag over one shoulder. She had composed herself carefully for this visit, the expression arranged into something pleasant and reasonable, the posture straight and controlled. She looked exactly the way she always looked when she had decided in advance how a conversation was going to go. Then she saw the sitting room behind me. The pleasant expression didn't disappear immediately. It took 2 or 3 seconds, long enough for her eyes to move from George in the armchair to Calvin on the sofa, to Marcus in the reading chair and back to me before something shifted underneath it. Not panic. Not yet. Something more like the recalculation that happens when a person realizes the room they have walked into is not the room they planned for. "Ruth," she said. Her voice was still steady. "Come in," I said. She stepped inside. I closed the door behind her. Nobody offered her a seat. She remained standing near the entrance to the sitting room, her bag over her shoulder, her eyes moving carefully between the 4 of us. George had his folder open on the side table beside him. Calvin was leaning forward slightly on the sofa, his forearms on his knees. Marcus had not moved. The silence lasted long enough to be deliberate. Then Calvin stood up. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the folded papers, the email thread, printed and organized, each message in sequence. He unfolded them slowly and held them in both hands. "I want to read something," he said. His voice was quiet and even. Not angry. Something steadier than angry. Diane's eyes went to the papers. A small muscle near her jaw tightened. Calvin began to read. He started with the earliest email in the thread, the one dated 11 months ago, the first communication between Diane and the attorney she had retained privately. He read it in full, without commentary, in the same steady voice. Then the second email. Then the third. He did not rush, and he did not editorialize. He simply read what was there, each message in the order it had been sent, letting the words do what words do when they are finally spoken aloud in the presence of the person who wrote them. Diane did not interrupt. She stood very still, her bag still over her shoulder, her face doing the complicated work of someone who is deciding in real time how to respond to something she cannot deny. By the 5th email, the one that discussed the forged signature specifically, the one that used the phrase, "the signature is the only obstacle," the pleasant expression was gone entirely. What replaced it was not guilt, exactly. It was the particular flatness of someone who has been caught not in a lie but in a plan, and who is now calculating what remains salvageable. Calvin folded the papers and sat back down. George spoke next. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. He set his reading glasses on his nose and looked at the document on top of his folder and stated, in the measured language of a man who had spent 40 years choosing his words carefully, exactly what the legal situation was. The limited power of attorney filed 8 months ago bore a forged signature, confirmed in writing by a certified forensic document examiner. Filing a forged instrument with legal intent constituted forgery in the first degree under South Carolina law, which was a felony carrying significant penalties. The documentation establishing this fact, the examiner's report, the authenticated comparison signatures, the filing records was complete and had been prepared for submission. Additionally, the email correspondence retrieved from a company device established a pattern of premeditated fraud extending back 11 months. "The complaint can be filed tomorrow morning," George said. He looked at Diane over the top of his glasses. "That decision belongs to Ruth." Diane turned to me. For a moment, she looked as though she might speak, might offer something, an explanation, a negotiation, some version of the careful language she had always been so skilled at constructing. Her mouth opened slightly. Marcus stood up from Thomas's reading chair. He crossed the room without hurrying and set his notebook on the coffee table in front of the sofa. He set it down gently, with both hands, the way you set down something that has weight and deserves to be treated accordingly. Then he stepped back and returned to his chair and sat down again. Nobody spoke. Diane looked at the notebook, at Calvin, at George, at Marcus, at me. Calvin stood for the second time that evening. He stood the way Thomas used to stand when something needed to be said, and he had decided he was the one to say it fully, without apology, taking up exactly the space the moment required. "This is my mother," he said. His voice was quiet and certain. "And this is my son, He looked at Diane steadily. "They will always have a place at my table." The room was completely still. Outside on Magnolia Street, the November evening continued its ordinary business, a car passing slowly, the distant bark of a dog, the wind moving through the camellia bush along the back fence. Inside, none of that registered. Inside, there was only the truth that had been a long time arriving, finally settled into the room where it had always belonged. Diane set her bag down on the floor beside her. She did not speak. For the first time, Diane had nothing to say. Just the truth sitting in the room where it had always belonged. The 2 weeks after that Tuesday evening were the quietest I had known in a long time. Not empty quiet, working quiet. The kind that fills a house when the thing you have been bracing for has finally happened, and what remains is the steady, unglamorous process of dealing with the aftermath one step at a time. George filed the criminal complaint the morning after Diane's visit. He called me when it was done, at 9:17 on a Wednesday morning, in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for every significant piece of news, good or bad, because he had always believed that the delivery of information should not add unnecessary weight to the information itself. The complaint had been received, he said. The relevant authorities would be in contact with Diane's attorney within the standard time frame. The documentation was complete and thorough. There was nothing left to do on our end but wait for the process to move at its own pace. I thanked him and went back to the rose bushes along the south fence that still needed cutting back before the first hard frost. The days had a different quality during those 2 weeks. I noticed it in small ways. I slept better than I had in months, not longer, just more completely, without the particular restlessness that comes from carrying something unresolved. I cooked proper meals instead of the abbreviated versions I had been managing since the Friday of the dinner. I finished rehemming the curtains from the sewing room and started on a quilt I had been meaning to begin since the previous winter. Marcus came by on Saturday morning, the way he always did. He sat at the kitchen table doing homework while I worked at the counter, and we talked about ordinary things, a history project he was working on, a book he had found on the shelf in the back room that had been Thomas's, whether the pecan tree in the backyard had enough left on it to be worth picking. He did not mention the Tuesday evening, neither did I. Some things don't need to be spoken about once they have been properly witnessed. On the Thursday of the second week, I drove to Columbia. Warren Oglesby met me in the lobby of Hartwell Industries' main office building, a clean, modern space in a business park off the interstate, the kind of building that looked like serious work happened inside it. He was a compact, direct man in his early 50s who had always communicated plainly and appreciated the same in return, which was one of the reasons the working relationship between Whitfield and Sons and Hartwell had lasted as long as it had. He shook my hand and walked me back to the conference room where the renewal documents were waiting. The meeting took the better part of 2 hours. I had asked George to prepare amended contract terms before the meeting, not punitive, but clear, with provisions that established more explicit protections for both parties and closed several of the ambiguities in the original agreement that, in hindsight, had made the attempted interference possible. Warren reviewed each amendment carefully, asked specific questions about 2 of the provisions, and accepted both of the answers I gave him without pushback. We signed the renewal across the conference table, 3-year term, the amended terms incorporated in full. Warren set his pen down and looked at me across the table. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I want to say something." He paused, choosing his words in the careful way that serious people do when they mean what they are about to say. "We became aware, recently, of the situation regarding the power of attorney and the attempts to interfere with the contract renewal process on your end." He met my eyes directly. "I want you to know that Hartwell had no knowledge of or involvement in any of that. When we learned what had been attempted, we took immediate action." I nodded. "We had no idea," he said, "who we were really dealing with." I looked at him across the signed documents. "Most people don't," I said. Warren held my gaze for a moment, then gave a single nod, the nod of a man who understood that this was the end of the subject and was satisfied with where it had landed. The immediate action Hartwell had taken, I had learned from George 2 days earlier, was the termination of Diane's firm's engagement on the commercial litigation matter she had been leading for 14 months. The decision had been made at the executive level and communicated to the firm in writing. The reasons given were professional in their language and unambiguous in their meaning. The firm had launched an internal review the following day. George had described the situation to me over the phone in his customary measured tone, but I had known him long enough to recognize the particular quality his voice took on when he was conveying information he considered a form of justice. The review was ongoing, he said. The criminal complaint would proceed on its own timeline, independent of whatever the firm decided internally. The two processes were separate, but, in practical terms, they pointed in the same direction. I drove home from Columbia on the interstate with the late afternoon sun coming in low through the driver's side window, the way it did on November afternoons when the light had already started its early retreat. The signed contract renewal was in the folder on the passenger seat beside me. 3 years, amended terms, my signature at the bottom of every page that required it. Thomas had built this company with those hands and this mind, and 30 years of quiet, unglamorous work. He had structured it so that the signature at the bottom of these pages could only ever be mine. Not because he doubted anyone else, because he trusted me completely, and he had built the paperwork to say so in language that no one could misread or misuse. Someone had spent 8 months trying to use that signature against me. They had studied it, replicated it, filed it, built an entire plan around it. And in the end, the only thing that signature had accomplished was to make visible everything that had been done in the dark. It had brought George into motion. It had brought Calvin to his mother's kitchen table with a notebook in his hands. It had brought Warren Oglesby across a conference table in Columbia with amended terms and a direct apology. I pulled off the interstate onto the Magnolia Street exit as the streetlights were beginning to come on. Diane had spent 8 months trying to take my signature. In the end, that signature was the thing that ended everything she built. He came on a Saturday morning, 3 weeks after the Tuesday evening that had changed everything. I was in the backyard when I heard the knock, not the doorbell, just his knuckles on the wood of the back door the way he had knocked since he was a boy, the particular rhythm of it unchanged across 30 years. I set down the trowel I had been using along the edge of the garden bed and pulled off my gloves and went inside. He was standing on the back steps in a dark green jacket with the collar turned up against the November cold, his hands in his pockets, looking out at the yard the way people look at places they have known a long time but are seeing differently than usual. "Hi, Mom," he said. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. "Come in." I put the kettle on without asking. Calvin sat down at the kitchen table, not across from where I usually sat, but at the side, the seat he had always taken as a boy when he was doing homework while I cooked, positioned slightly sideways to the table as though he might need to get up quickly. I noticed it without commenting on it. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the camellia bush had finally gone bare the way it did every November, the last of the season's blooms given up to the cold. The pecan tree at the back of the yard still held a few leaves, yellow and reluctant, not quite ready to let go. I waited while the kettle heated. Calvin turned his coffee cup on the table in front of him, a slow, deliberate rotation, the same thing he had done with whatever was in front of him since he was small, when he was thinking through something difficult. "I filed the divorce papers Thursday," he said. He said it to the table, not to me, in the flat tone of someone delivering information they have been carrying for several days and are finally setting down. "I know," I said. He looked up. George mentioned it. I turned back to the kettle. "How are you?" "I don't know yet," Calvin said. Honestly, that was the most honest thing he had said to me in a long time, and I told him so. He almost smiled. The kettle boiled. I poured 2 cups and carried them to the table and sat down across from him. He wrapped both hands around his cup the way Thomas used to do on cold mornings, and for a moment the resemblance was sharp enough that I had to look away briefly at the window. "I knew something," he said. I waited. Not everything. Not the forgery, not the Hartwell contract, not he stopped. But about 4 months ago, Diane mentioned the power of attorney, said she thought it would be a good idea to have something in place. In case you ever needed help managing the business, he looked at his cup. She said it was just being practical, that you were getting older and it was responsible to plan ahead. He paused, and I believed her, he said, not because it made complete sense, because it was easier to believe her than to ask you directly. He looked up at me. That's the part I keep coming back to. I chose not to ask. The kitchen clock ticked on the wall above the refrigerator. A car passed slowly on Magnolia Street outside. "Why didn't you ask me?" I said. Calvin was quiet for a long moment. "Because I think I knew," he said finally, "that if I asked, I'd find out something I wasn't ready to deal with." He shook his head slowly. "That's not an excuse." I know it isn't. That's the truth of it. I looked at my son across the kitchen table, at the tiredness in his face that had been there since the Saturday lunch at the restaurant on King Street, the particular exhaustion of a person who has been maintaining something unsustainable for longer than they should have. He was 41 years old. He had Thomas's hands and Thomas's stubbornness, and when he remembered to use it, Thomas's ability to look at a hard thing without flinching. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said. His voice had gone quiet and level, for the phone call where I used Diane's words instead of my own, for not asking, for taking the easy version of things when the true version was right there if I'd been willing to look. He paused. "I'm sorry." I let the apology sit in the room for a moment without rushing past it. "I know you are," I said. He looked at me. He stopped. Started again. Is there a way back from this?" I picked up my coffee cup and held it with both hands, the warmth of it familiar and steady. There was a version of this conversation where I told him that everything was fine, that it was all forgotten, that we would simply continue from here as though the past several months had not happened. It would have been the easier version. It also would not have been true. "Rebuilding takes longer than breaking," I said. "Are you ready for that?" Calvin looked at me steadily across the table. "Yes," he said. "No qualification. No follow-up. Just the word, said in the simple, direct way that Thomas had always reserved for the things he meant completely. I nodded once and set my cup down. Outside, the last yellow leaves of the pecan tree moved in the November wind. The camellia bush stood bare along the fence, already preparing in its quiet way for whatever came next. We sat at the kitchen table for another hour, talking. Not about Diane, not about lawyers or documents or the pieces that were still moving through their various processes. About Calvin's work, which he had been neglecting and was ready to return to. About Marcus, who had been staying with a school friend during the most difficult weeks and was coming back to Magnolia Street for the weekend. About the guest room, which had always been Calvin's room before it was a guest room, and whether he might need it for a while as things settled. He said he might. I told him it was there. Before he left, he stood at the back door for a moment, looking out at the yard, the same way he had when he arrived. The garden beds turned for winter, the bare camellia, the reluctant pecan tree, the yard where he had grown up playing, and where Thomas had spent 30 years building something worth passing down. He turned back to me. "Thank you, Mom," he said. I didn't tell him it would be easy. I told him it would be worth it. And for the first time in years, I believed he understood the difference. 6 months is both a long time and not long at all, depending on what you are measuring. If you are measuring by the calendar, by the movement of seasons, the turning of months, the ordinary accumulation of days, then 6 months is considerable. The November that had held all of that difficult autumn gave way to a December that was quieter than most, and then to a January that was cold and clear, and then to the slow, unhurried arrival of a Charleston spring that came the way it always did, without fanfare, simply appearing one morning in the camellia bush along the back fence on Magnolia Street. If you are measuring by the changes that those months carried, then 6 months turns out to be enough time for a great deal. I opened the shop on a Saturday morning in early May. It was a small space on King Street, 2 doors down from the coffee shop where Sandra stopped every morning on her way to wherever she was going, which made the logistics of her daily visits considerably more convenient for both of us. The front window faced east and caught the morning light in a way that was good for the work. I had painted the walls a soft cream color and put Thomas's photograph on the shelf behind the cutting table, where I could see it from anywhere in the room. The sign above the door read simply, Whitfield Alterations. I had not planned to open a shop. The idea had arrived the previous winter, during one of the long, quiet evenings when the house on Magnolia Street was full of the particular stillness that follows the resolution of something difficult. I had been sitting in the sewing room working on the quilt I had started in November, and Marcus had been at the kitchen table doing homework, and at some point he had wandered to the doorway and stood watching me work with the focused attention he brought to everything. "Can you teach me that?" he asked. I looked up. "Which part?" He gestured at the whole of it, the fabric and the needle and the way the pieces came together into something that hadn't existed before. "All of it," he said. I had thought about Thomas then, about the notebook in his shirt pocket and the way he had measured success not by size or noise but by steadiness, about the jar on the kitchen shelf that had bought the first truck, about 30 years of building something carefully, one decision at a time, without requiring anyone to watch. And I had thought about a shop on King Street with good morning light. Marcus came in every Saturday. He was 13 now, taller than he had been in November, his shoulders finally beginning to catch up to the collared shirts that had always sat too wide on him. He had inherited Thomas's patience with detail work, the willingness to undo 3 stitches and redo them correctly rather than leave something almost right, and he was, to my considerable satisfaction, genuinely good at it. He didn't talk much while we worked, which suited both of us perfectly. Sandra arrived most mornings at 9 with 2 coffees from the place, 2 doors down, and whatever she had decided to have an opinion about that day, which was always something. She had taken it upon herself to become the shop's unofficial ambassador to the King Street neighborhood, mentioning it to everyone she encountered, and speaking about our alterations, work with the enthusiastic authority of someone who had been involved from the beginning, which she had not, but which I had decided was not worth correcting. The shop did well. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes news or requires celebration. Steadily, the way things grow when they are built on something real. Calvin had found an apartment 6 blocks from Magnolia Street in January. He came for dinner most Sundays, the way he had when he was first starting out, back in the years before everything had gotten complicated. He and Marcus had developed the particular easy companionship of 2 people who had come through something difficult together and discovered, on the other side of it, that they actually liked each other. On Saturday afternoons, when Marcus was done at the shop, Calvin sometimes took him to the hardware store or the batting cages or wherever the afternoon seemed to want to go. I watched this from a careful distance and tried not to show how much it meant to me. George audibled. Audible, tamention audible pace. The criminal case was moving through the system at the pace such things moved, which was deliberate and unglamorous, and largely out of my hands. The firm's internal review had concluded. The Hartwell contract renewal was performing exactly as the amended terms had specified. Everything, he said, was in order. I thanked him and asked about his grandchildren, and we talked for 20 minutes about things that had nothing to do with any of it. On a Saturday morning in May, after Marcus had gone home and Sandra had finished her second coffee and the last customer of the morning had collected her altered dress and gone back out into the King Street sunshine, I sat down at the cutting table in the quiet shop and did something I had been meaning to do since the previous autumn. I took Thomas's letter from the drawer where I kept it now, not the bedroom safe, but close, where I could reach it easily, and I unfolded it along its original creases and read it through once, the way you read something you know well but want to return to deliberately. The handwriting was the same as it had always been, deliberate and unhurried, the kind of handwriting that belonged to a man who did not write anything he didn't mean. I read through the practical pages, the careful instructions, the list of things George would be able to show me. I read the paragraph about Marcus. Tell him I knew. Tell him he was always mine, and looked up at the photograph on the shelf behind the table, at Thomas's face in the picture I had put there, because it was the one where he looked most like himself. Then I read the last 2 lines. Everything I built has your name on it. Use it when the time comes. I folded the letter carefully along its creases and set it on the table in front of me. The morning light came through the east window and lay in a long rectangle across the cutting table, the way it did every Saturday at this hour. Outside on King Street, Charleston went about its ordinary Saturday business people, with coffee cups and dogs and the unhurried pace of a city that has been here long enough to know that most things worth having take time. Thomas had written those words 3 weeks before he died, sitting in the garden chair by the window that caught the afternoon light, with the camellia bush just beginning to bloom outside, and whatever certainty he carried about the future already settled in his chest, like something he had long since made peace with. He had believed I would know when the time came. I finally had, and it turned out the time had been coming for 30 years,